She never worked a real day in her life. My daughter-in-law whispered to the guests at my husband's funeral, loud enough for me to hear as I stood 3 feet away holding the folded flag from his service. I adjusted the black gloves in my lap and kept my eyes on the church flowers instead of turning around. After 41 years of marriage, I had learned that humiliation sounded quieter when delivered with a smile. I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm 70 years old, and 3 days ago I buried my husband, Richard. The morning of the funeral arrived cold and gray, the kind of Connecticut morning where the sky hangs low enough to feel personal. I woke before sunrise in the house Richard and I bought together in 1987, when Nathan was still in middle school and we thought our hardest years were behind us. The bedroom felt unfamiliar without the sound of Richard's breathing beside me. His reading glasses were still resting on the nightstand exactly where he left them the night before his heart gave out in his sleep. I stood there for a long moment staring at those glasses because moving them felt too permanent somehow, like admitting he wasn't coming back for them. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and lilies. The funeral home had sent over extra flowers the night before, and now the entire house carried the heavy sweetness of arrangements people buy when they don't know what else to offer. I poured myself half a cup of coffee, but couldn't drink more than a sip. My hands wouldn't stay steady enough. By 8 o'clock, Brooke had arrived wearing a fitted black dress and pearl earrings that somehow looked more suited for a charity gala than a funeral. She kissed the air beside my cheek without touching me. "You should probably wear something simpler," she said while looking me over near the staircase. "You don't want people thinking you're trying too hard today." I looked down at the black dress Richard bought me for our 40th anniversary dinner in Boston. Simple black fabric, long sleeves, nothing flashy. The same dress he once said made me look elegant. "Richard liked this one," I answered quietly. Brooke gave a small shrug. "Well, I'm just thinking about appearances." Nathan stood behind her near the doorway holding his car keys. My son looked exhausted, but not from grief. He looked like a man trying not to be inconvenienced by emotion. "We should get going," he muttered without meeting my eyes. The church was already crowded when we arrived. Richard had spent 32 years running his accounting firm in Fairfield County, and people respected him. Men in dark wool coats lined the entrance, speaking in low voices, while women hugged each other beneath bare maple trees, shaking in the November wind. I recognized nearly everyone there. Former clients, neighbors, old friends from our country club before we let the membership go after Richard retired. People approached me with soft expressions and careful sympathy, but something felt strange beneath it. Hesitation, curiosity, like they had heard something unpleasant before I arrived. During the service, I sat in the front pew beside Nathan while Brooke moved gracefully through the aisle greeting guests like she was hosting an event. Every so often I caught her leaning towards small groups of people, lowering her voice just enough to create intimacy. Then came the glances in my direction afterward. Quick looks, tight smiles. One woman actually patted my hand and said, "Well, I'm sure Richard enjoyed taking care of you all those years." I remember blinking at her because I didn't understand what she meant at first. Richard and I built our life together. I spent 28 years teaching 3rd grade while raising Nathan and balancing every bill, every move, every crisis that came through our front door. But by the time the funeral reception began downstairs in the church hall, I started hearing the whispers more clearly. Brooke said Evelyn never handled any finances herself. Apparently Richard paid for absolutely everything. She'll probably have to sell the house now. Then finally, near the coffee table beside the reception line, I heard Brooke laugh softly before saying the sentence that settled into my chest like ice. Honestly, she was just living off his money anyway. Several people gave uncomfortable chuckles. Someone noticed me standing there. The conversation stopped immediately. Brooke turned toward me with a perfectly composed smile. "Evelyn," she said sweetly. "People were just saying how beautiful the service was." I looked at her for a moment. At the flawless makeup, the polished hair, the calmness in her eyes. Then I looked at Nathan standing 20 feet away, pretending not to notice any of it. And in that instant, while the scent of funeral lilies filled the room and strangers avoided looking directly at me, I realized something colder than grief. My husband had only been gone 3 days, and already they were rewriting my place in my own family. The reception hall slowly emptied after the service ended, but I stayed seated near the back corner beside a window overlooking the church parking lot. The November rain had started falling lightly against the glass, blurring the rows of black cars outside into soft gray shapes. Someone had left a paper cup of coffee near my elbow nearly 20 minutes earlier. It had already gone cold. Across the room, Brooke moved from table to table with effortless ease, touching arms gently when she spoke, lowering her voice at the right moments, smiling with that polished sympathy people trusted too easily. She looked less like a grieving daughter-in-law and more like a woman stepping carefully into a role she had waited years to claim. Every now and then, I heard my name drift across the room in fragments. Poor Evelyn. She never understood the finances. Richard handled everything. Each sentence landed softly, almost kindly, which somehow made them hurt more. Nathan stood near the dessert table speaking with two of Richard's former business partners. I watched my son straighten his suit jacket the same way his father used to before important meetings. The resemblance hit me suddenly and painfully. For a brief moment, I saw the little boy who used to wait by the front window every Friday evening for his father to come home from work carrying pizza boxes and strawberry ice cream. Nathan used to adore Richard. And once upon a time, he adored me too. I remembered school science fairs where he begged me to stay beside his display until every judge passed by. Sunday mornings when he climbed into bed between Richard and me holding cartoons under his arm. Family road trips to Cape Cod where Nathan insisted I sit beside him during thunderstorms because he thought mothers could keep bad weather away. I do not know exactly when that tenderness disappeared. Sometimes change does not arrive like a storm. Sometimes it slips quietly into a house room by room until one day everything familiar feels cold. Mrs. Carter? I looked up to find Sophie standing beside me holding a small plate with a dinner roll and 2 slices of turkey. At 16, she still carried softness in her face that Brooke had not managed to harden yet. You barely ate anything, she said quietly. I forced a small smile. Thank you, sweetheart. She sat beside me without asking permission and glanced carefully across the room toward her mother. Mom should not have said those things earlier, she whispered. My fingers tightened slightly around the paper cup. What things? Sophie hesitated. She keeps telling people Grandpa worried about you spending too much money after he retired. The room suddenly felt warmer and harder to breathe in. Richard retired 5 years ago after decades of 12-hour workdays and sleepless tax seasons. The first thing he did afterward was take my hands across our kitchen table and say, now it is finally our time. We traveled more during those years than we ever had before. Maine in the fall, Arizona in the spring. Quiet little inns where Richard woke before sunrise just to bring me coffee exactly the way I liked it. We lived carefully but comfortably because we planned our lives together carefully. Every mortgage payment, every college tuition bill, every sacrifice. I spent 28 years teaching elementary school while grading spelling tests at our dining room table late into the night after Nathan went to sleep. But now, standing only a few feet away from Richard's framed funeral portrait, people were discussing me like some aging woman who had floated through life on someone else's paycheck. Sophie lowered her voice even further. I heard Mom talking to Dad last week. She thinks you should probably move after Christmas. I stared at her. Move where? Sophie looked down at her folded hands. She said the house is too big for one person now. Upstairs in that house were 41 years of my life. Richard's sweaters still hanging in the closet. Pencil marks inside the pantry door measuring Nathan's height every birthday until he turned 18. The kitchen island Richard built himself during one snowy February because I once mentioned wanting more counter space while baking pies. I looked across the hall again at Brooke laughing softly beside a group of women near the coat rack. Then I noticed something else. My chair sat alone in the far corner while Brooke occupied the center of every conversation in the room. Even here, at my husband's funeral reception, they had already begun rearranging the family around my absence. The house felt painfully quiet after the funeral guests finally left that evening. I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing untouched casserole dishes while rain tapped softly against the windows over the sink. Richard always hated silence in the house. Even during ordinary weeknights, he kept jazz music playing low in the background while reading financial reports at the dining room table. Now the only sound came from the running water and the old grandfather clock near the staircase, counting seconds I did not know how to fill anymore. Nathan and Brooke had offered to stay the night earlier, but Brooke phrased it carefully. We just want to make sure you are not overwhelmed with everything. The way she said everything made it sound less like grief and more like inventory. I told them I would be fine alone. Brooke looked disappointed for half a second before covering it with sympathy. Around 9 o'clock, I carried a stack of folded black table linens toward the hallway closet when I heard voices drifting from the living room. Nathan and Brooke had apparently returned after forgetting Sophie's sweater in the guest room upstairs. Their coats were still by the front door. I stopped near the hallway without meaning to listen, but then I heard my name. "You need to talk to her soon," Brooke said quietly. "The longer we wait, the messier this gets." Nathan sounded tired. "It has only been 3 days, Brooke." "Exactly. Which means people still feel sorry for her. That is the best time to convince her downsizing is practical." I stood completely still beside the hallway table where Richard used to toss his car keys every evening after work. "She cannot stay in this house forever," Brooke continued. "The taxes alone are ridiculous. And honestly, your father would have wanted you handling things now." There was a pause before Nathan answered. "Mom is emotional right now." "Evelyn has always been emotional," Brooke replied softly. "That is why Richard handled the money." I lowered my eyes toward the hardwood floor because suddenly I could not trust my face not to show something. For years I had convinced myself Brooke's comments were misunderstandings, personality differences, little moments blown out of proportion by stress. But standing there in the dim hallway beside framed family photos, I finally began connecting memories I had ignored for too long. 5 years earlier, when Richard and I celebrated our 40th anniversary, Brooke insisted on organizing the dinner party herself. Halfway through dessert, she stood to make a toast and laughed while telling our guests, "Richard deserves a medal for surviving all Evelyn's shopping habits." Everyone chuckled politely while I smiled into my wine glass, even though I had spent decades clipping coupons and balancing school budgets down to the penny. Then there was Christmas 2 years ago when Brooke handed me an envelope during dinner and said brightly, "Since you are retired now, we figured you could contribute more time instead of gifts." Inside was a printed babysitting schedule for Sophie during their ski vacation in Aspen. I remembered how Nathan avoided eye contact that night too. One memory after another began settling into place with quiet precision. Brooke operated carefully, never cruel enough to create a scene, never obvious enough for people to question her intentions. Just small humiliations delivered with perfect timing until eventually everyone around me accepted her version of who I was. Nathan's voice lowered again in the living room. "Maybe we should wait until after Thanksgiving." Brooke sighed. "Nathan, be realistic. Your mother cannot manage this place forever. And if we are eventually going to move in here, renovations take time." "Move in here." I looked slowly around the hallway. The antique mirror Richard restored by hand one summer after finding it at an estate sale. The staircase where Nathan sat every Christmas morning at age 6 wearing footed pajamas waiting for permission to run downstairs. The cream-colored wallpaper Richard spent 2 entire weekends hanging because I once mentioned liking it during a drive through Vermont. They were discussing my home like future property before Richard's flowers had even begun to wilt. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly. Sophie must have heard them too, because a few seconds later she descended the staircase holding her sweater tightly against her chest without saying a word. When she passed me in the hallway, our eyes met briefly. Hers looked embarrassed. Mine probably looked older than they had that morning. The next morning, I woke before dawn to the sound of wind brushing softly against the maple tree outside our bedroom window. For a few seconds, I forgot Richard was gone. I reached instinctively toward his side of the bed expecting warmth and found only cold sheets neatly folded beneath my hand. The silence afterwards settled heavily across my chest. I stayed there staring at the ceiling while pale morning light slowly crept through the curtains Richard insisted on buying during our trip to Charleston 10 years earlier. He said the blue fabric reminded him of the Atlantic Ocean at sunrise. Richard noticed details like that, small things other people overlooked. That was one of the reasons I loved him for 41 years. Downstairs, I moved carefully through the kitchen, making coffee I did not really want. The house still smelled faintly of funeral flowers and candle wax. Sympathy cards covered half the dining room table beside casseroles from neighbors who probably assumed I was too heartbroken to cook for myself. Maybe I was. But grief felt different from what I expected. Quieter, colder, less like crying, and more like slowly realizing the floor beneath your feet has shifted without warning. I carried my coffee into Richard's study for the first time since the funeral. The room looked untouched. Dark walnut shelves lined with accounting books. His leather chair slightly angled toward the desk lamp. A pair of reading glasses resting atop a legal pad filled with neat blue handwriting. Richard always wrote everything down. Phone calls, appointments, investment notes, grocery lists. Order gave him comfort. I sat carefully in the chair across from his desk and let my fingers rest against the polished wood surface. That was when I noticed the framed photograph near the corner lamp. Nathan at age 12 standing between Richard and me after winning second place at his middle school science fair. Nathan's smile stretched wide beneath crooked braces while Richard held his shoulders proudly. I remember driving across 3 towns that night trying to find the exact telescope kit Nathan wanted because he had worked so hard on that project. Richard and I built our lives around giving our son stability neither of us had growing up. Richard worked endless tax seasons while I graded spelling tests at the kitchen table after midnight. We skipped vacations some years so Nathan could attend better summer programs. When Nathan struggled with math in 8th grade, Richard sat beside him every evening for 4 straight months until his grades improved. We never kept score inside our marriage because that is what families do. They give without tallying receipts. Yet somehow, over the years, Brooke transformed those sacrifices into proof that I contributed nothing at all. Sitting there in Richard's office, memories surfaced one after another with uncomfortable clarity. Brooke correcting me at dinner parties whenever finances came up. Brooke laughing lightly whenever I mentioned my teaching career as though elementary school classrooms were little hobbies instead of decades of work. Brooke once telling guests during Thanksgiving, "Richard handles all the important decisions in this family." Everyone laughed politely while I smiled and passed mashed potatoes around the table. At the time, I convinced myself I was being oversensitive. Now I wondered, how many insults become truth simply because no one challenges them? My eyes drifted toward a small stack of unopened mail beside Richard's desk organizer. Most were sympathy cards, but one envelope stood apart. Thick cream-colored paper with the return address of Bennett and Rowe Legal Services embossed neatly across the corner. Harold Bennett, Richard's attorney for nearly 30 years. My stomach tightened slightly. Richard trusted Harold with everything from business contracts to estate planning. I turned the envelope over carefully in my hands. Unopened. Addressed directly to me in Harold's precise handwriting. Before I could think too deeply about it, the downstairs doorbell rang sharply through the quiet house. I glanced at the clock. 8:15 in the morning. No one visited this early unless they carried bad news. When I opened the front door, Brooke stood on the porch wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky and holding 2 oversized coffee cups from the expensive cafe downtown. "I thought you might need company," she said brightly. Then her eyes drifted past me toward the staircase and hallway like someone mentally measuring rooms. Nathan and I were actually hoping we could talk about the house today. Brooke stepped inside, carrying the coffee cups carefully balanced in one hand, while the scent of expensive vanilla perfume followed her through the doorway. She looked perfectly composed for someone visiting a widow less than 24 hours after a funeral. Her camel-colored coat probably cost more than my first teaching salary back in 1978. "I brought you a latte," she said brightly as though we were old friends meeting for brunch instead of 2 women quietly circling the remains of the same family. I thanked her and led her toward the kitchen. The unopened envelope from Harold Bennett still rested upstairs on Richard's desk exactly where I had left it. For reasons I could not explain yet, I suddenly did not want Brooke anywhere near Richard's study. She sat gracefully at the kitchen island while removing her gloves finger by finger. "This house feels very large now," she said after a moment, glancing toward the dining room. There it was. Not grief, not concern, real estate. I stirred untouched coffee slowly beside the sink. Richard and I liked the space. Brooke gave a sympathetic smile. "Of course, but maintaining a property this size alone at your age cannot be easy." At your age? Funny how age becomes visible to people only when they want something from you. I remembered being 52 and driving across town at 6 in the morning every weekday to help Brooke after Sophie was born because daycare costs felt overwhelming for them at the time. I remembered spending entire weekends painting Sophie's nursery pale yellow while Brooke rested upstairs scrolling through decorating magazines. Nobody mentioned my age back then. "Nathan worries about you," Brooke continued softly. "And honestly, The market is incredible right now. Houses in Fairfield County are selling within days. I looked toward the breakfast nook where Richard used to sit every morning reading financial news with half-moon glasses balanced low across his nose. The ceramic mug he always used still sat drying beside the sink from the last dishwasher load before he died. Some people leave behind silence when they are gone. Richard left behind presence. Every room still carried traces of him. "This is still my home," I said quietly. Brooke nodded immediately, too quickly. "Of course it is. Nobody is saying otherwise." But her eyes kept moving. Dining room, staircase, window measurements, kitchen layout. She was already imagining different furniture and spaces Richard and I spent decades building together. The front door opened suddenly around 10 o'clock, and Nathan walked in carrying his phone and laptop bag like he had come directly from the office instead of morning leave. "Hey," he said distractedly before kissing Brooke lightly on the cheek. He looked at me carefully afterward, almost cautiously. "How are you holding up today, Mom?" Holding up. As if grief were some unstable shelf everyone expected to collapse eventually. "I am managing," I answered. Nathan loosened his tie and sat beside Brooke at the island. For a moment, watching them together beneath the pendant lights Richard installed himself during our kitchen remodel 12 years earlier, I felt strangely outside my own life. Like a guest sitting quietly inside another family's home. Brooke folded her hands neatly. "I was just telling Evelyn that maybe we should start discussing practical next steps." Nathan rubbed the back of his neck. "We just want to help." Help. Such a harmless word. I remembered another conversation 6 years earlier after Richard retired. Nathan and Brooke invited us to dinner at an upscale steakhouse downtown. Halfway through the meal, Nathan suggested consolidating some of our investments under a younger financial planner he and Brooke trusted. "You should simplify things while you still can," Brooke said back then, while sipping red wine beneath low restaurant lighting. Richard smiled politely afterward in the car, but said quietly, "Funny how people rush older folks towards smaller lives." At the time, I laughed because I thought he was exaggerating. Now, sitting in my own kitchen beside two people discussing my future like a scheduling inconvenience, I realized Richard had noticed far more than he ever admitted aloud. Nathan finally looked up at me directly. "Mom, maybe it makes sense for you to consider something easier. A condo. Less upkeep. Less stress." I stared at my son for several seconds before answering. Behind him, sunlight touched the framed family photograph hanging near the pantry door. Nathan at 16 standing between Richard and me after his high school baseball championship. His arms thrown proudly around our shoulders. We looked inseparable back then. "Your father built this house for us," I said quietly. "Not temporarily. Not until it became convenient for someone else." The kitchen fell silent after that. Brooke lowered her eyes toward her untouched coffee cup. Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. And for the first time since the funeral, I noticed something subtle move across Brooke's face. Not sympathy, not guilt, concern. After Nathan and Brooke left that afternoon, I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock above the pantry door. The house seemed to exhale once they were gone. I gathered the untouched coffee, cups from the island, and rinsed them slowly beneath warm water while replaying every word from the conversation in my head. Practical next steps. Easier living. Downsizing. Funny how quickly people start reducing your life into manageable pieces once they decide you no longer belong at the center of it. By late afternoon, sunlight stretched pale and thin across the hardwood floors near the living room windows. I finally returned upstairs to Richard's study carrying the unopened envelope from Harold Bennett in trembling hands. The room still smelled faintly of cedarwood and old paper. Richard always kept the windows cracked slightly even during winter because he claimed fresh air helped him think clearly. I sat carefully in his leather chair and opened the envelope with the silver letter opener he received after 25 years at the firm. Inside were several neatly folded documents along with a handwritten note from Harold. "Evelyn, if you are reading this alone, please call me before discussing any financial decisions regarding the estate. Richard was very specific about certain arrangements, and I believe you should hear them directly from me." My heartbeat slowed strangely instead of speeding up. Beneath the note sat copies of trust paperwork bearing both Richard's signature and mine dated nearly 4 years earlier. I frowned slightly trying to remember the meeting. Then it came back to me. A rainy Tuesday afternoon downtown after lunch at our favorite Italian restaurant. Richard insisted we stop by Harold's office, just to update paperwork. I remembered signing several documents while joking that retirement had turned Richard into a man obsessed with filing cabinets. At the time, I barely skimmed the pages because I trusted my husband completely. Now, sitting alone in his office with grief still hanging heavily in the air, I forced myself to read every line carefully. Certain phrases stood out immediately. Irrevocable family trust. Primary beneficiary, Evelyn Carter. Residential property protected from external transfer without beneficiary authorization. I read the paragraph twice more before setting the papers down slowly in my lap. The house was not automatically transferring to Nathan at all. Richard had protected it. Protected me. A sharp ache rose unexpectedly in my throat because suddenly I could hear Richard's voice so clearly. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just thoughtful in the quiet way he always was when something troubled him. About 3 years ago, after Brooke made another joke during Christmas dinner about eventually inheriting the big Carter house, Richard stood beside me at the sink afterward drying dishes while everyone else watched television. Some people count rooms before the owners are even gone, he murmured quietly. I remember laughing uncomfortably and telling him he was imagining things. He only gave me that small tired smile of his and changed the subject. Maybe he had noticed the shift long before I did. The phone rang downstairs around 6 o'clock, pulling me from my thoughts. I carried the documents carefully back into the desk drawer before answering. Mrs. Carter, a warm, familiar voice asked. This is Harold Bennett. I lowered myself slowly onto the staircase. I received your letter. Harold paused briefly. I thought perhaps you had. Richard wanted me to check on you personally before anyone pressured you into making decisions too quickly. Pressure. Even hearing someone else say the word made my stomach tighten. Nathan and Brooke already mentioned selling the house. I admitted quietly. Another pause. Longer this time. Evelyn, Harold said carefully. Richard anticipated there could be conversations like that after his passing. That is exactly why he structured the trust the way he did. I closed my eyes for a moment. Downstairs, evening shadows stretched across the living room where Richard used to fall asleep watching baseball games with the volume too loud. So the house is protected? I whispered. Completely, Harold answered. And there are additional assets you are not aware of yet. Richard wanted to ensure your independence no matter what happened after he was gone. Independence. The words settled differently inside me than comfort or security. Stronger somehow. Outside, wind rustled through the maple tree near the driveway while darkness slowly covered the front lawn. For the first time since the funeral, something unfamiliar stirred quietly beneath the grief. Not relief. Not happiness. Clarity. The days after my conversation with Harold passed differently than the days before it. Grief still followed me through every room of the house, but now something steadier existed beneath it. Awareness changes the shape of silence. Before, I wandered through the house feeling abandoned inside my own life. Now I started paying attention. Brooke called every day that week, sometimes twice. Her voice always sounded warm at first. Just checking on you. Making sure you are eating. Seeing if you need help organizing Richard's paperwork. But eventually, every conversation curved back toward the same destination. The house. The future. Logistics. Nathan came by Thursday evening, carrying takeout containers from my favorite seafood restaurant downtown. 20 years ago, that gesture would have melted me immediately because Nathan used to remember every little thing that made me happy. Now I noticed how distracted he looked while setting food onto the kitchen counter, like a man rehearsing difficult conversations in his head. We ate quietly at the dining room table beneath the chandelier Richard installed himself after saving for nearly a year to afford it. Nathan barely touched his food. Finally, he folded his napkin beside his plate. Mom, he said carefully, Brooke and I have been discussing some options that could make things easier for everyone. Easier for everyone. Interesting phrase. Richard once told me people reveal their intentions by the pronouns they choose. I set my fork down gently. What kind of options? Nathan leaned back in his chair. This house is worth a fortune now. You could sell it, move somewhere smaller, and still live comfortably for the rest of your life. Comfortably. Another word people use when discussing older women as if they are fragile pets needing relocation. And what happens to the rest of the money? I asked quietly. Nathan blinked slightly, probably surprised by the directness of the question. Well, obviously we would help manage investments. Brooke has already researched some excellent retirement communities near Stanford. There it was again. Brooke already researching. Brooke already planning. Brooke already arranging the next chapter of my life without asking whether I wanted one written for me at all. I glanced toward the china cabinet near the far wall. Inside sat dishes Richard's mother gave us during our first Christmas as newlyweds when we lived in a tiny apartment above a laundromat in New Haven. We built everything slowly together. Nothing in this house appeared by accident. Your father never mentioned wanting me to leave this home, I said. Nathan sighed heavily and rubbed his forehead. Dad worried about you being alone here eventually. A lie. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just smooth enough to pass unnoticed if someone was grieving too deeply to challenge it. But I had already read the trust documents. I already knew Richard spent years making sure I would never be forced out of this house by convenience, pressure, or manipulation. Nathan continued speaking while staring down at his untouched iced tea. Brooke thinks maybe after Thanksgiving we could start looking at listings together. Brooke thinks. Brooke wants. Brooke believes. Funny how my son no longer spoke in his own voice, without her standing somewhere behind it. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly. Sophie appeared at the dining room entrance wearing an oversized Yale sweatshirt and holding a chemistry textbook against her chest. Dad, she said quietly, Mom asked if you signed the contractor estimate yet. The room fell still for half a second. Nathan looked up too quickly. What contractor? I asked softly before he could answer. Sophie froze immediately, realizing she had said something she was probably not supposed to reveal. Nathan stood abruptly from the table. Nothing important. Just maintenance ideas Brooke mentioned. But Sophie's expression told the truth before anyone else spoke another word. Embarrassment. Unease. The kind teenagers cannot hide well yet. I looked from my son to my granddaughter standing awkwardly beneath the dining room archway while the grandfather clock ticked steadily beside us. Contractor estimates. Renovations. They were not discussing possibilities anymore. They were preparing for ownership. Nathan reached for his coat too quickly afterward. We should not overwhelm you with details right now, he muttered. I nodded calmly and gathered empty plates from the table while he avoided looking directly at me. Only after the front door closed behind him did I allow myself to stop moving for a moment. The kitchen suddenly felt very still. Then, slowly, I looked toward Richard's study upstairs where the trust documents remained hidden safely inside his desk drawer. They thought I was grieving too much to notice what they were doing. What they did not understand was that grief sharpens certain people instead of weakening them. Thanksgiving arrived 2 weeks later beneath a cold silver sky that made the trees outside look almost colorless. Richard always loved Thanksgiving more than Christmas because he said gratitude felt quieter and more honest than celebration. For 41 years, our dining room held the same traditions. Turkey in the center of the table, candles near the windows, Sophie helping me arrange napkins while Richard pretended to steal pieces of pie before dinner. This year, I almost canceled everything entirely. But 3 days before the holiday, Brooke called with unusual excitement in her voice. We thought it would be good for you if we hosted everyone at the house this year, she said warmly. Not your house. The house. The wording sat heavily with me long after the call ended. By noon on Thanksgiving Day, Brooke had transformed my kitchen into something that no longer felt fully mine. Stainless steel catering trays lined the counters because she decided homemade food was too stressful this year. A florist delivered modern white centerpieces I never would have chosen. Brooke floated through every room giving instructions while wearing cream-colored cashmere and gold bracelets that chimed softly whenever she lifted wine glasses or adjusted place settings. The dining room photographs beautifully in afternoon light, she told one of her friends while gesturing toward Richard's antique china cabinet. Photographs beautifully, like the house had become a backdrop instead of a home. I stood near the sink, quietly peeling sweet potatoes no one had asked me to prepare. Every so often guests approached me with gentle smiles and careful voices usually reserved for hospital waiting rooms. How are you holding up, Evelyn? It must feel strange being here without Richard. Strange. That word again. As though I were visiting temporarily instead of standing inside the house where I raised my son and buried half my life. Around 3 o'clock, more guests began arriving carrying wine bottles and desserts. Brooke greeted them at the front door with effortless confidence, touching elbows lightly and laughing softly at compliments about the renovations she hoped to make someday. Someday. Nathan spent most of the afternoon watching football in the den while pretending not to notice how naturally Brooke had positioned herself at the center of everything Richard and I built together. Then came the moment that changed something permanently inside me. I had just carried a tray of dinner rolls into the dining room when I heard Brooke speaking near the fireplace to a couple from Nathan's office. Once we update the kitchen and open up the back wall toward the garden, the whole property will feel completely different, she said casually while sipping white wine. One of the guests smiled politely. That sounds expensive. Brooke laughed lightly. Well, eventually it will all belong to Nathan anyway, so we might as well start planning ahead. My hands tightened slightly around the warm tray. Not because of the words themselves, because of how easily she said them, like my absence had already been accounted for. Sophie appeared beside me quietly and took the tray from my hands before I dropped it. Grandma, she whispered carefully, are you okay? I nodded once and looked toward the dining room table. Brooke had moved the seating cards around some time earlier without mentioning it to me. My usual chair beside Richard's at the head of the table was gone. In its place sat Brooke between Nathan and the carved turkey platter, while my name card rested near the far corner beside the hallway entrance. A temporary seat. Out of photographs. Out of the center. Sophie noticed it too. I saw the anger flicker briefly across her young face before she looked away. Mom changed the seating chart this morning, she muttered softly. Across the room, Brooke smiled brightly toward me as though nothing at all was unusual. Evelyn, she called sweetly, we thought you might prefer the quieter seat this year. Prefer. Another harmless word carrying sharp edges beneath it. Around us, guests continued talking and laughing while silverware clinked gently against crystal glasses. Nobody else seemed to notice the shift taking place in plain sight. Or maybe they noticed and simply found it easier to remain polite. I looked at the empty chair where Richard should have been sitting. Then I looked at the place Brooke had taken for herself so naturally, so confidently, before the grief inside this house had even settled properly into the walls. And suddenly, for the first time since the funeral, I stopped feeling hurt. Hurt still asks for understanding. What settled inside me instead felt colder, clearer, like finally seeing the shape of something that had been standing in front of me all along. The dining room glowed warmly beneath candlelight, while rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the backyard garden Richard planted 20 years earlier. Guests filled their wine glasses and complimented Brooke on the elegant table arrangement, while the scent of rosemary turkey and buttered rolls drifted through the house. From the outside, everything probably looked perfect. A successful family gathered for Thanksgiving inside a beautiful Connecticut home. But perfection has a strange way of cracking once people become too comfortable pretending. I remained standing near the sideboard for a few moments after noticing my seat had been moved. Nobody rushed to correct it. Nobody seemed uncomfortable enough to object. Brooke simply adjusted a linen napkin beside her plate at the head of the table, while Nathan avoided looking directly at me. Then Sophie quietly picked up my place card from the corner seat and carried it back toward the center beside her own chair. Grandma always sits here, she said calmly. The room went still in that subtle polite way wealthy people become silent when conflict threatens dinner. Brooke laughed softly first. Sweetheart, we just thought your grandmother might prefer a quieter spot this year. Sophie did not move. She has sat beside Grandpa every Thanksgiving since before I was born. Nathan finally cleared his throat. Sophie, do not make this into a big thing. But something had already shifted. I could see it in the way several guests lowered their eyes toward their plates. People notice more than they admit. They simply prefer comfort over honesty most of the time. I stepped forward before the moment could stretch into embarrassment for Sophie. It is all right, I said gently while touching her shoulder. I can sit anywhere. Brooke smiled immediately, relieved the discomfort was dissolving. See? Evelyn understands. Understands. Such a carefully chosen word. As though accepting disrespect quietly were a sign of wisdom instead of exhaustion. I looked at the chair Brooke had claimed beside Nathan beneath the chandelier Richard spent months restoring by hand. Then I looked at my granddaughter still standing protectively beside the seat meant for me. For the first time in weeks, I realized someone in this family still saw me clearly. Dinner continued with forced normalcy after that. Football scores, college applications, housing markets. Brooke guided conversations effortlessly from one topic to another while refilling wine glasses and accepting compliments about the evening. But beneath the polished surface, Tension lingered quietly around the table like smoke nobody acknowledged directly. Halfway through dessert, Brooke lifted her glass lightly and smiled toward the guests. "I know this year has been emotional for everyone," she began softly. "But Nathan and I are grateful we can start creating new traditions together as a family moving forward." New traditions. Moving forward. Every sentence gently repositioning herself closer to the center while inch by inch pushing Richard and me into memory. Nathan nodded beside her without speaking. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap and studied the faces around the table. Richard's former business partner looked uncomfortable. One of Brooke's friends stared down at her wine glass. Sophie looked openly angry now. Funny how children sometimes recognize cruelty faster than adults because they have not yet learned how to disguise it with manners. Then Brooke added the sentence that finally removed all remaining doubt from my mind. "Richard always worried Evelyn depended on him too much," she said with a sympathetic smile. "He wanted Nathan and me to help guide things after he was gone." A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Somewhere near the kitchen, silverware clinked softly against china. I looked slowly toward Brooke while keeping my expression calm. Richard never said those words. Not once in 41 years. In fact, the last thing my husband did before dying was legally ensure nobody could control my future after he was gone. I suddenly understood something important sitting there beneath candlelight and polished crystal. Brooke did not merely want the house. She wanted authorship. She wanted to rewrite the family story itself. The capable son, the graceful daughter-in-law, the aging widow too fragile to manage alone. And for weeks, I had allowed grief to keep me silent while she narrated my life for me inside my own home. But silence only protects dignity when people still possess some of their own. I set my dessert fork gently onto the plate and lifted my eyes toward Nathan for the first time all evening. "Your father trusted me with every important decision we ever made," I said quietly. The room fell silent again. Nathan froze slightly beside Brooke. Across the table, Sophie's expression softened with relief. And Brooke, for the briefest moment since Richard's funeral, stopped smiling.